Well, after 34 years, India has a new education policy. It's progressive and, if implemented properly, should have a positive impact on the lives of millions of students in India. Is it realistic? Can it be implemented? And should it have been introduced in Parliament for discussion first? Here's a quick look at what's in store. Firstly, the right to education has been extended to cover children between the ages of 3 and 18 instead of 6 to 14. Education for all by 2030. The new 10+2 system will be divided into a 5+3+3+4 format. This basically means that 3 of the first 5 years are dedicated to pre-primary education that finds a great deal of importance attached to it. There is no rigid formation of streams of arts, commerce, science in schools. Teaching is up to at least class 5 in the mother tongue or a regional language. The board exams across states are meant to test knowledge application, not rote learning. IITs will become more multidisciplinary with arts, humanities as well. The new education policy proposes a 4-year undergraduate program. Courses will have multiple exit options. We'll be discussing all of this. And the Aimful, which now exists, could be discontinued. If you have a 4-year program, perhaps an Aimful may not be required. Well, joining us now, Dr. K. Kasturirangan. We've known him as a former ISRO chairman, but he joins us today as the leader of the committee, the chair of the committee which drafted the National Education Policy. Thanks very much for being with us, sir. Dr. Kasturirangan, language and the confusion that exists to a certain extent, local languages or the mother tongue up till class 5, is that compulsory or will an option be available, say, for English?
Thank you, Vishnu, in interacting with you once again, but on this educational policy. Regarding the language, we have a chapter on languages which enunciates the totality of the policy that we need to adopt as a part of the education involving the languages. And there are multiple elements to this language policy. I don't want to go into the details of that, but it does recognize the fact that we are a country with very rich in languages and we have to do justice to that. The questions which regard to the ability for the plurality of languages that we have, the 18 mainstream languages, classical languages, modern languages, and then there is a question of the international communications, for which we need a separate policy regarding the language learning and process related to that. So there are many, I think, we have done this. The central point about what you have tried to raise on the school level is one thing which we debated quite a lot in terms of importance of bringing in the mother tongue or the local language or the home language or the regional language. The rationale that we have tried to use in trying to make this recommendation of a language for making for the studies, what you may call as the mother tongue, is the reason is the fact that we have it recognizes the evolution of the cognitive abilities of the child, the ability to comprehend. Absolutely. And so on.
Dr. Kasturirangan, I take your point entirely, the importance of your mother tongue or a home language, but just a simple question, is it compulsory in terms of education? Would the parents of children have the option to educate their kids in another language, for example, English?
Vishnu, there is no compulsion about any language being imposed on any state for any kind of studies.
Okay, that's important.
We are given a 3-language formula which is consistent with even the earlier policy. All we say is you choose, make your choices, but mother tongue, one more national language, and if English is to be chosen, that is also available. A 3-language formula with that kind of a flexibility is available.
Right.
If the choice is to be made for learning things through English, and if that is what the decision of the parent is, or if the people who are there for the child to decide, then I think the policy by itself does not create any hurdles with regard to that decision.
Let's look at a few of more very interesting areas. Pre-primary education has been given a very big focus, but I also notice that very young children, perhaps even below class 4, will have to take an exam for the first time. Why is that the case?
Well, you know, the pre-primary education has been given a lot of importance simply because we have for the first time recognized the aspect of brain growth and its ability to comprehend, or what you may call as a cognitive sciences. And we have factored this aspect of how the brain develops up to the age of 8, where you go, development is almost 80-85% of the final
Yes.
maturity value. And we had to make sure that the corresponding inputs that you go as educative inputs for the child does factor this aspect of the ability of the cognitive ability of the brain. And also we have recognized the fact that the children do not have a uniform linear growth of this kind of a capability. So we have to take that into account and look at the distinct differences between the growth of the brain for different children. And this is the reason why we have created the first 5 years as a foundational period where no structured education is imposed on the child. This is only an unstructured way, you perspective, conceptual, and things of that kind will come into picture. And only after the first 5 years you start looking at a more ordered way of studying, including books and so on.
Right.
And ultimately the last 4 years you try to get into a situation where the youngster is able to comprehend the kind of inputs that you normally give through teachers,
Dr. Kasturi
through
Rangan,
books and many other kinds of things, and preparing him for a broader role in the society.
Dr. Kasturi Rangan, throughout this process, how are you consciously moving away from rote learning to less stress-free learning, where creativity of the child is given priority, also with many options? I mean, you don't have to be a science student who only does science, or you don't have to be a humanities student who doesn't do science either. So, you know, it's how is it part of a creative process of learning?
Vishnu, the central point in this is the continuous evaluation of the progress of the youngster with respect to how he is comprehending the various inputs that are given to him in terms of the lessons, in terms of the kind of education that is imparted to him. So this is one of the things where you try to bring in a constant evaluation of the student, how well is he learning, of the learning capability, absorption capability, and the ability to be creative. This is evaluated all through the education. So it is not a one-time, one-step evaluation at the end of a year where you are told to immediately remember many things that you learned and immediately write some questions and answers. This is not the way in which the present policy envisages this. So that is one of the important differences.
Two final questions, short ones. Firstly, how is a lot of this geared towards vocational education? It's not just education for the sake or learning for the sake of learning, it's learning for an ultimate life goal, potentially a life goal. How have you brought that in, sir?
You know, first of all, the vocational education has several layers of complexities, and there are many areas, whether it is related to carpentry, for electrical jobs, for gardening, in terms of agriculture, in terms of the medical support and things of that kind. There are enough amount of provisions in a multidisciplinary educational system of the last 4 years of the secondary school, where this is brought in as an additionality. And those who want to take up at least one vocational education subject will be a part of the secondary education.
Sure.
And if they want to make a study, or if they want to out of this, they can pick up areas where they can go more detailed to make themselves a useful professional even at the secondary stage, and they can work with the local institution which is concerned with the subject that he is interested.
Absolutely fascinating, sir. Quite landmark in many ways, and one hopes that the quality of life ultimately in our country through education improves. Always a pleasure speaking to you, Dr. Kasturi Rangan. Thank you very much for being with us. Well, joining us now, Ashish Dhawan, founder and chairman of the Central Square Foundation, which focuses extensively on education. Also, Lata Vaidyanathan, the former principal of Modern School here in Delhi. Ashish, let me come to you first. Some statistics, some numbers which I had are on research. Apparently, total investment on research and innovation in India has declined as a percentage of our GDP from 0.84% in 2008 to 0.6% in 2018. And the number of researchers in India per 1 lakh of the population is minuscule, just 15, compared to many other countries. How will this new education policy potentially change that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think, as you know, one of the reasons why Indian universities don't figure in the top 100 or top 200 rankings globally is not because we don't have world-class students. We absolutely do, but really because our research has been below par. It's frankly because of the lack of money, but it's also incentives, research culture, prioritization. It's a number of things. So I think one step in the right direction, which is laid out in the policy, is the formation of a new National Research Foundation. I think most countries that have focused on research and innovation have an overarching body that channelizes research funding. So the National Science Foundation in the US, NIH, National Institute of Health in the US, are two bodies that channelize $35–40 billion a year. And alongside that comes in private capital and other forms of capital as well to fund basic research at universities. China has done the same in terms of setting up a national natural science foundation. I think India is attempting to do the same with this National Research Foundation. This is a good intent, but as you said, I think a lot will depend on how much money we actually put behind it, the ultimate structure, how independent it is of government. I think the good news right now is our principal scientific advisor to the Prime Minister is actually driving this effort, and how much actual coordination there is, because currently research money is allocated by Department of Science and Technology, Department of Biotechnology, a number of different agencies.
Right.
And so we are not putting all the money in through the National Research Fund. This is still more of a coordinating body with some funds of its own that prioritizes certain areas. So I think the intent is good, but much will depend upon the execution.
Sure, the implementation. Key question over there. Ma'am, let me come to you next. The focus on pre-primary education, how important is that? And secondly, the entire effort at trying to make learning more holistic and less stressful, how is that going to potentially alter lives?
Thank you, Vishnu. I think that's a very important area. Sometimes you get a feeling that nothing happened for decades, and sometimes decades happens in weeks. And this
is that how you're feeling? Is that how you're feeling now?
That's exactly how I'm feeling.
Have happened overnight, this suddenly emerged. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, but I think we are battling on too many fronts, and therefore we're feeling that we are moving very fast, particularly the teaching community as such. And I'm feeling very good about it. The vision document, which has, the entire new policy, is basically a good vision document, and one feels that there is a progressive, futuristic, actionable reality that's possible if things are set in proper perspective and process. As far as the early childhood education is concerned, and this major shift that has happened into 5+3+3+4 is in a way very sensible and well researched, and I think it's keeping with all the international norms that one sees. But the real impact will be in its details. When we look at this early years, which is 5 years, and it's referred to in this document as foundational years, and if you look at the structures that exist in our country, I think it's really very challenging. There are 2 or 3 things which really worry us today. For example, earlier, the early years came under the Ministry of Women and Child Welfare, and they were the Anganwadi schemes. Now, what happened was, these Anganwadis were very close and very easily accessible to people. Today, when we look at the document in detail, it appears as if these 5 years will be close to primary schools or with primary schools or with even senior larger schools, and they will have a comprehensive structure.
Yeah.
If that is so, have we factored in the access, the equity principle, as also the qualitative aspect of making sure that this entire process of education that we are looking at in the early years will be properly delivered?
Sure, ma'am, very important points, all of that. I just wanted to go across to Ashish for another quick comment. At the college level, there's a diploma which can be given within a year, within 2 years something else, then a third year's diploma or a degree, and the fourth year you get a proper undergraduate degree. This means that different students, depending on their skill set, some in the vocational line can actually be properly trained and still be certified. You don't necessarily have to go through a full degree. Now, that has both its advantages and its disadvantages. Would you like to reflect on that?
No, I think it reflects the reality that not all students who are going into higher education seek the same objectives, and neither do they have the same qualifications coming in. So I think the 1 and 2 year exit options, the associate degree and the diploma, are really largely vocational in nature. If I want to become an IT hardware maintenance person, I don't need a 4-year undergraduate degree. I don't need to study computer science or engineering. I can do a shorter 1 or 2 year program, associate degree or diploma, and now I'm qualified, I can get a job. On the other hand, if I actually want to go deep into a discipline and have a more rigorous academic experience, I then need to be on the 3 or 4 year pathway. And given that the policy talks about a sort of interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, holistic approach, I think if you want the whole hog, you probably need 4 years, because you'll spend the first year sort of exploring and then get the 4 years.
But I think the fact that the options actually exist, it's interesting.
I think it addresses the issue that we have different kinds of jobs coming out. They have different requirements and different learners coming into the system who may seek different objectives out of higher education.
I'd like to thank both of you very much for joining us and sharing those views. We'll come back to both of you later on another day and track a lot of these thoughts a lot more closely. Thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you, Vishnu.
We're now joined by the senior Congress leader, Shashi Tharoor. He's written and spoken about education and the draft education policy in the past as well. You had concerns in the past about an imposition of Hindi. That's not going to happen now, it appears. But is there any concern that you may have as far as perhaps foreign languages dwindling as an option or in importance, which is also important as we talk about India in a larger context?
Actually, that's not my concern so much, I must say, Vishnu. I do compliment the Minister, Dr. Ramesh Pokhriyal Nishank, because when he circulated the draft and some of us gave comments, he invited me for a meeting. We spent about 2 hours together, and he seems to have taken a number of my objections seriously, and those elements have gone from the new policy. So I welcome that. My concern is, you asked about foreign languages, by the way. I think that option still exists, and it's always going to be up to the individuals if they want to do that. So that's not a big concern for me. I have a bigger set of anxieties, not objections as much as concerns. The first is that there is this huge question of why they have unleashed this during the COVID lockdown period without having come to Parliament, presented it, had a discussion, and then adopted the policy. It's almost as if they've forgotten we have a parliamentary system in this country. My second concern is that the aspirations are actually good, and we heard Dr. Kasturi Rangan lay out a very ambitious agenda, which I welcome, but can we ensure they're matched by implementation? Because many of the things that they're talking about in this national education policy requires resources that the Modi government has consistently refused to give education.
In fact,
the target of 6%
of
GDP is not new. We've been hearing it for decades.
Yeah, in fact, you've written about this from 1948. So 6% of GDP, if you're going to revamp education completely without actually achieving that, it's going to be impossible. So from a financial standpoint, do you believe this is unrealistic in the near future?
Well, it's unrealistic unless part of the cabinet approval is a commitment by the finance minister to allocate more money. Every year in the last 6 years, the budget has actually had less money for education. So can they give us more? And if they're willing to give education more money and they can commit to it, I don't know where that money is coming from, but that'll be very useful.
Sure.
Similarly, in particular, the whole research and innovation component of education, which is so indispensable. We've been talking about it for years, going back to Sam Pitroda's time. The truth is that Manmohan Singh at least tried to reach 1% of GDP, though the ultimate target was supposed to be 2%. Under the BJP government, it's come down to 0.6%. And that's really worrying because we don't have enough people in India dedicated to research. And that's the yardstick internationally, globally, as sort of what the standard of education, higher education should be all about.
15
Similarly,
researchers for 1 lakh
about
of population compared to 111 from China. That's something that
Correct.
you've mentioned. So that's abysmally low, and that's something that needs to be involved. How about the process of learning itself? The fact that children can now choose a lot more, humanities and sciences can work together, the education is more complete. Isn't that something that's going to transform lives?
I think that's very good. One of the things I welcome, by the way, in this document is the implicit built-in flexibility. I've been arguing, for example, a dozen years ago, before I came into politics, I wrote a column about an Oxford study that showed that at that point, 98% of all terrorists arrested or identified in terrorist attacks were engineers. And the reason I surmised is because engineers, particularly in our developing countries, are only taught engineering, the sciences, everything is black and white. It's either this way or that way, switch is either on or off. None of the nuances and subtleties that come with studying liberal arts is available to a science or engineering student. And I had argued at that time, before I came into politics, that we must make it compulsory for science students to learn some humanities and for humanities students to learn some science, so we create more well-rounded human beings. Now, for the first time, this has actually become possible. And if this is something that they will do both in high school and the streaming practice, let kids take the subjects they're good at, so you don't have to only do biology, chemistry, physics. If you happen to be very interested in biology but not interested in physics, and you would like to take a history course, if that's now possible, that's going to be revolutionary, and I think it'll really create much more interested, keen minds coming out of our school system. And the same for the colleges. Right now, you take an honors degree, that's all you study pretty much. I remember in my college days, we had 2 subsidiary subjects only in the freshman year, and the rest we were focused heavily on our honors subject. Whereas the American system, for example, encourages you to study a lot of courses well beyond your so-called major. Now, if again, this policy implies we're going to do that in India, I think it'll be very good. Yeah. It'll bring our undergraduates up to par with the best global standards. I welcome that. My worry, I never quite got to because of your other questions, is that there is implicit a strong tendency towards centralization. I'm a little worried about how much they're going to be shoving onto the private sector because they won't have the resources to do all the things they say they want to do.
Right.
I'm worried about the neglect of adequate, qualified, trained teachers in our system, which this report doesn't seem to do enough to address. And finally, I am concerned that we should ensure our education policy doesn't undo the progress made in extending higher education to the poor and the marginalized in our society.
Aimful appears to have disappeared, at least in the plans. It's not going to be there anymore. Is that something that it's going to be discontinued? Is that something which, what are your views on that?
I think it's linked to this idea that the fourth year of the BA will be enough to equip an undergraduate or a fresh graduate to go straight into research and into doctoral studies. Now that, for example, is the American system. In America, you do a 4-year BA, you can enroll in a doctoral program. If you don't persist with the doctorate, you can take an MA in between, take a lower level exam and get an MA. But it's not compulsory in every American university to enroll for the MA. You can do you can graduate as a BA after 4 years and enroll in a doctoral program. So if their idea is, listen, our 4th year is going to be so solid, you're equipped with the basics you need to be a researcher or do a doctorate, then you don't need the MPhil as an intermediate step.
Sure.
The MPhil was conceived at a time when you had a 3-year bachelor's degree, and because of the 3 years bachelor's degree, you needed something more to prepare you to be ready to do research, write a thesis, and eventually be qualified enough to do a PhD. Right. That's why the MPhil. We won't need that anymore.
Well, this is all very ambitious. Let's see how it works out. But it's exciting. And people have really, really thought through all of this. Let's hope a large amount of this is realized. Shashi Tharoor, always a pleasure speaking to you. Thanks very much for being with us. It's time now for us to take this short break.